There is an episode of Family Guy where a crowd of Jewish characters scrambles on the ground for pennies thrown at them like pigeons. The Anti-Defamation League called it outrageous. The show kept going. There is an episode where the only Muslim character with real screen time turns out to be a terrorist. It aired 29 days before a real bombing at the Boston Marathon. The network pulled it from streaming within the week. There was a black main character voiced by a white man for 21 years. The white man eventually stepped down. The writing did not change. Family Guy has been called racist since its second season. It has been canceled twice, survived both cancellations, and is still on the air. And the man who made it told a reporter in 2012 that at the core, none of them gave a damn. Today we are going to go through exactly how that happened, episode by episode, decision by decision. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let us get into it. The White Actor Problem, Mike Henry and Cleveland Brown, Seasons 1 to 19. For 21 years, nobody talked about it. Every Sunday night, millions of people sat down and watched Cleveland Brown, one of the only black main characters on primetime animated television, and nobody in charge seemed to think it was worth mentioning that the man doing his voice was white. Not just white, but a white man who had grown up in Virginia, gone to school in Alabama, and developed Cleveland's slow, gentle drawl by listening to a real friend of his who talked that way. His name was Mike Henry. He was one of the show's original writers. He had been there since day one, since the pilot episode in 1999, since before Family Guy was even a hit. And for over 2 decades, he showed up to the recording studio, sat behind a microphone, and became the voice of the show's primary black character, without the show, the network, or the broader conversation around television ever really stopping to ask whether that was okay. This is where the story of Family Guy and race actually begins. Not with a specific joke, not with a single episode that crossed a line, but with a foundational decision baked into the show before it ever aired its first episode. The choice to have a white actor play Cleveland Brown was not unusual for 1999. The Simpsons had been doing the same thing for a decade. Animation as an industry had operated this way for as long as anyone could remember. The argument was simple and, at the time, mostly accepted without question. Voice acting is just acting. The audience cannot see the performer, and the best person for the role should get it regardless of race. That argument held up for a long time, right up until the moment it stopped holding up at all. Cleveland Brown arrived in the pilot episode of Family Guy as one of Peter Griffin's 3 closest friends. He lived next door, he was mild-mannered, soft-spoken, patient almost to a fault. His defining characteristic in those early seasons was that he was the calm one, the guy who occasionally tried to pump the brakes when Peter's ideas started getting dangerous, the one with a slightly more level head. He had a wife named Loretta and a son named Cleveland Jr. He owned a deli. His laugh was distinctive, a warm, sort of surprised chuckle. He was, by the standards of what Family Guy was doing at the time, a reasonably drawn character, but something shifted as the show went on. The show's writers, the overwhelming majority of whom were white, started making choices about Cleveland that reduced him rather than developed him. His calm personality started reading less like wisdom and more like passivity. He became the friend who absorbed things without reacting, the friend who was there when Peter needed him, but did not seem to need much of anything himself. His blackness, which in the early seasons was simply a fact about him, began to function more and more as the joke itself. What he did, what he said, what happened to him, it increasingly came back to race, and not in a way that felt considered or sharp. It felt reflexive. It felt like the writers reaching for the easiest version of the character available. The most famous running gag involving Cleveland is the bathtub gag. Over and over across the show's run, whatever chaos Peter creates ends up destroying the front wall of Cleveland's house, catching Cleveland mid-bath, sending his bathtub crashing to the ground as he screams a string of no's on the way down. It is purely physical, purely slapstick, and Cleveland is always the one getting hurt. He is the house that gets knocked down. He is the tub that falls. The gag ran for seasons. Cleveland was the target so reliably, so consistently, that the show eventually gave him his own spin-off, partly as a way to get him out of the orbit of Peter's destruction. The Cleveland show ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. It was created by Seth MacFarlane alongside 2 other writers. It was meant to give Cleveland a real story, a new city, a new family, a new life as a lead character, rather than a supporting one. In practice, critics were not kind. John McWhorter, writing for The New Republic, called it a patronizing mess and described it as basically Family Guy in blackface. Tom Shales at The Washington Post called MacFarlane no better than a dirty old man hanging around playgrounds with bad jokes. USA Today's Roberto Bianco suggested the easiest solution to the show's problems was cancellation. It ran 4 seasons before Fox pulled it in 2013. What is important about the Cleveland show for this conversation is is not whether it was good or bad as a comedy. What is important is who made it. The writers were overwhelmingly white. The voice of Cleveland was still Mike Henry, a white man. The voice of Rollo, Cleveland's 5-year-old stepson, was also Mike Henry. Rollo was written as a smooth-talking, ladies' man type character modeled on 1970s black exploitation film archetypes. A 5-year-old coded as a pimp. One reviewer at the time, writing for a college newspaper, noted that the show's humor almost entirely circled back to Cleveland's race. Almost every reference, almost every joke came back to the fact that Cleveland was black. When the show was not doing that, the reviewer wrote, it was ripping off Family Guy so directly, it was hard to believe both came from the same creative team. When the Cleveland show was canceled, Cleveland came back to Family Guy in a season 12 episode called He's Black. The title is a joke. The exclamation point is a joke. The return of a character who had been gone for 4 seasons is framed primarily as an opportunity for his friends to roast him about his show being canceled and his blackness. In the episode, Quagmire greets him with a line about how it must be strange to move for reasons other than a hurricane. Cleveland does not respond to this. Later, Peter pulls Cleveland over while pretending to be a police officer, then assaults him. Cleveland does not fight back. Later still, Peter deliberately crashes a car carrying both of them, forgetting that only his side of the car had airbags. Cleveland ends up in the hospital. Peter walks away without a scratch. A cultural analysis by a writer named Kyle Zielinski documented this pattern in detail. The argument it makes is that through Cleveland, Family Guy consistently sends a specific message that black people will absorb mistreatment, will not push back, will not stand up for themselves. Every time Quagmire makes a crack about race and Cleveland lets it pass, the show reinforces that. Every time Peter does something that hurts Cleveland and Cleveland accepts it without reaction, the show reinforces that. The pattern is not random. It is structural. It runs across Cleveland's entire time on the show. The academic layer of this conversation is even sharper. A thesis published through a university in New York argued that Family Guy's portrayal of Cleveland and his family relies on minstrelsy, an old and deeply harmful tradition in American entertainment where black people are portrayed through exaggerated, demeaning caricature, usually by white performers, for the amusement of white audiences. Minstrelsy is not a minor footnote in American history. It is the foundational form of racist entertainment that shaped how black people were represented in popular culture for over a century. The thesis argues that Family Guy recycles those structures without acknowledging what they are. The show presents them as irreverent comedy, as equal opportunity offense, as nobody being safe. But the weight of those choices falls harder on Cleveland than it does on anyone else because the history behind those images is longer and more damaging. For 21 years, this was just how the show worked. Then, in the spring of 2020, something changed. George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis on May 25th. Protests spread across the country. Hollywood began a very public reckoning with how it had operated for decades. Conversations that had been happening quietly for years suddenly moved to the center. On June 26, 2020, Mike Henry posted a message to social media. He wrote that it had been an honor to play Cleveland on Family Guy for 20 years. He said he loved the character, and then he said that he would be stepping down from the role because persons of color should play characters of color. Henry had already recorded a number of season 19 episodes before making this announcement, which meant his replacement would not take over immediately. The transition was not clean. The first episode of season 19 still featured Henry's voice. Eventually, a performer named Arif Zahar was confirmed as the new voice of Cleveland. Zahar described Cleveland as his favorite cartoon character of all time, and said he was shocked and saddened when Henry stepped down, before learning he would take over the role. For comparison, The Simpsons made a broader, cleaner statement. The show's producers released a statement in June 2020 that the show would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters. Full stop. Family Guy did not make that commitment. Instead, a season 19 episode appeared to hint that the show would move in that direction, but the show stopped short of a firm policy. This is worth noting because it follows a pattern that runs through Family Guy's entire relationship with its own offensiveness. The partial step, the hinted change, the suggestion of accountability that does not quite arrive. The show had done the same thing with gay jokes. In January 2019, the episode Trump Guy included Peter Griffin telling a cartoon version of the president that the show was trying to phase out gay jokes. The executive producers confirmed this shift. Seth McFarland confirmed it. And then, in the season 18 episode Disney's The Reboot, which aired in October 2019, Peter was asked about phasing out gay jokes and replied that the quote was taken out of context and widely misunderstood. The change that had been announced with some seriousness was walked back with a punchline. This is the show's institutional move. Acknowledge, partially. Retreat, quietly. Continue. Mike Henry's departure was real and meaningful. Arif Zahar taking over as Cleveland is a genuine change. much. But the casting was one layer of a much larger issue, and it was the layer most easily fixed without changing anything structural. The writers are still overwhelmingly white. The show's relationship to Cleveland as a character, what he is allowed to do, what happens to him, what his blackness means in any given scene, that relationship was not altered by changing who sat behind the microphone. 21 years is a long time. Family Guy premiered when most of its current audience had not been born yet. The show grew up alongside a generation, and Cleveland Brown was there for all of it. Patient, slow-spoken, repeatedly knocked down, reliably failing to push back. Voiced by a white man. Written by white writers. Seen by millions of people every week who absorbed all of that without anyone in a position of authority ever suggesting that anything about it was worth examining. The casting was the most visible problem, which is perhaps why it was the first one fixed. What the show was doing with Cleveland on the page, in the actual scripts, in the choices about what he could say and what could be done to him, that part never got a public announcement. Nobody posted a statement about it on social media. Nobody confirmed they were phasing it out. The show simply continued, with a new voice, doing mostly the same things. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that brings us to something more specific, because the Cleveland situation, for all its significance, was structural and slow-moving. It built up across 2 decades, but Family Guy also went sharp and deliberate in individual episodes, targeting specific groups with specific jokes that generated immediate backlash and very short memories. One of those episodes never even made it to air for 4 years. The network buried it, sat on it, hoped the conversation would go away, and eventually released it anyway. And the song at the center of it ended up in federal court. Section 2, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The episode Fox hid for 4 years. Season 3, episode 22, 2000/2003. Fox had the episode finished. The animation was done. The voices were recorded. The music was mixed. Everything was ready to go. And then somebody in charge watched it, thought about what was going to happen when it aired, and decided the answer was to put it in a drawer and walk away. This was the year 2000. Family Guy was still a young show, still finding its audience, still trying to figure out exactly how far it could push things before something broke. The episode in question was originally produced to air during Hanukkah of that year as part of Season 2. It had been written by a staff writer named Ricky Blitt. It had a full musical number in it. It had a guest voice from Ben Stein, who is Jewish. It had, by every technical measure, been completed and delivered. And Fox looked at it and said no. Not no forever, just no for now, which turned out to mean no for 3 years. The episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it finally made it to audiences on November 9th, 2003, when it aired on Adult Swim, the late-night block on Cartoon Network that had been running Family Guy reruns and helping rebuild the show's audience after its first cancellation. It aired there first, uncensored, before Fox eventually broadcast its own version in December 2004, with one specific lyric changed, and the episode placed, somewhat quietly, into the rotation as if the 4-year delay had been perfectly normal. It had not been perfectly normal. The delay was a decision, and the decision was driven by fear. Fox's executives looked at the episode and concluded it was too risky. Their words, or close enough to their words that the framing stuck. Seth MacFarlane later joked about this before an Adult Swim airing, saying that in this case, too risky meant anything that does not feature a celebrity half naked on the hood of a car. He described the episode as centered around Peter Griffin's misconceptions about the Jewish community, which was his way of saying the episode was about anti-Semitic stereotypes and whether the show could get away with playing them for laughs. The answer, it turned out, was complicated. Here is what the episode actually does. Peter Griffin loses the family's money. This is not unusual. Peter losing money, Peter making a bad financial decision, Peter being taken advantage of by a scam is a reliable engine for Family Guy plots in the early seasons. In this case, he gives Lois's emergency fund to a man selling volcano insurance. Volcano insurance in Rhode Island. Peter believes this is a sensible purchase. The money is gone. Depressed and stuck, Peter hears Quagmire and Cleveland talking about men with Jewish-sounding names who had helped them achieve financial success. Cleveland mentions that a man with a Jewish name handled his money. Quagmire mentions something similar. Peter, being Peter, processes this as straightforward information rather than as the coincidence it almost certainly was, and concludes that what he needs is a Jewish person to fix his finances. He then sings about this. The song is called I Need a Jew. It is a direct parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic Disney song from the 1940 film Pinocchio. The melody is the same, the structure is the same, the lyrics are not the same. Peter sings about needing a Jewish person to solve his money problems. He runs through the idea that Jewish people are naturally gifted with finances. He name-checks famous Jewish people as evidence. In the original DVD version, the version that went out before any broadcasting notes could touch it, there is a lyric that goes, Hebrew Hebrew people I have adored, even though they killed my Lord. The show recorded an alternate version of that line. The alternate goes, Hebrew people I have adored, I don't think they killed my Lord. The alternate is the version that aired on television, and is the version currently available on most streaming platforms. That change is worth sitting with for a moment. The show produced two versions of a lyric. One version states, as comedy, that Jewish people killed Jesus, a charge that has been used to justify anti-Semitic violence for centuries, and is one of the oldest and most dangerous anti-Semitic claims in existence. The other version softens it, hedges it, makes Peter sound merely uncertain rather than accusatory. The show judged, correctly, that the original lyric was too much. But the fact that it was written at all, recorded at all, included in the DVD release at all, tells you something about where the writers' minds were when they put the episode together. After the song, Peter tracks down a Jewish man named Max Weinstein, whose car has broken down outside the Griffin house. He pressures Max into helping him recover the lost money from the volcano insurance scammer. Max succeeds. Peter, who is not subtle about anything, interprets this as confirmation that his belief is correct. Jewish people are simply better with money. He decides that if being Jewish guarantees financial success, the logical next step is to make his son Chris Jewish. He plans to convert Chris to Judaism and have him undergo a bar mitzvah, believing this will automatically make Chris smarter and more financially capable. Lois finds out. She drives from Rhode Island to Las Vegas. The show acknowledges the absurdity of this by simply not dwelling on it, to stop the ceremony. She interrupts the bar mitzvah with the argument that success has nothing to do with religion, that Peter's belief is wrong, and that converting a child to a religion based on a financial stereotype is not a plan. The congregation, hearing Lois appear to insult Judaism, turns on the Griffins. The family escapes. Peter accepts that he was wrong. The episode ends with a group of nuns attacking the family on a bus, because Peter also technically abandoned Catholicism during the episode, and the show wanted a joke to close on. Now here is where the defense comes in, because there always is one, and in this case the defense has some real substance behind it. Ricky Blitt, the writer of this episode, is Jewish. Seth MacFarlane has stated this publicly and repeatedly. The show took the episode to two rabbis before production, and asked whether the content was acceptable. Both rabbis said it was, specifically because Peter learns the right lesson at the end. He realizes his belief was a stereotype, not a fact, and he apologizes. MacFarlane also pointed out that 70% of the Family Guy writing staff is Jewish, a figure he cited as evidence that the episode came from a place of insider knowledge, rather than outside mockery. Ben Stein, who is Jewish and had a long career as a financial commentator in addition to his acting work, agreed to voice the rabbi character. The defense is essentially that the joke was made by people with standing to make it, that the target was the stereotype rather than Jewish people themselves, and that the episode explicitly corrects Peter's thinking by the end. These are not nothing arguments. The fact that a Jewish writer wrote the episode matters. The fact that the show consulted rabbis matters. The fact that Peter is the one being mocked, Peter, the show's designated idiot, matters, because the show consistently uses Peter's stupidity as the frame through which offensive beliefs get aired and then corrected. The Archie Bunker model, where the bigot is the fool rather than the hero, is a real and legitimate way to use comedy to critique prejudice, but Fox still hid the episode for 4 years. And that tension between the internal defense and the external decision to suppress the episode entirely is what makes this case so interesting to think about. If the episode was clearly and unambiguously satirizing anti-Semitism, rather than deploying it, there would have been no reason to sit on it. Fox made a business decision that the episode was too likely to be misread, too likely to generate a reaction that would damage the show and the network. That business decision implies that the content was genuinely ambiguous, that a reasonable person watching the episode could come away not having absorbed the lesson, but having absorbed the stereotype. There is also the song itself to consider. The lesson at the end of the episode, delivered through dialogue, is that Peter was wrong, but the lesson delivered through the song, a full, completed, catchy musical number that runs for a solid chunk of screen time, is a list of anti-Semitic assumptions treated as Peter's sincere beliefs. The song is performed, the song is funny, the song is memorable, the corrective dialogue at the end is also there, but it is a scene. It does not have a melody. People do not hum corrective dialogue on the way to school. I Need a Jew became one of the more quoted moments from the early seasons of Family Guy, and what people tend to quote from it is not the lesson Lois delivers in Las Vegas. This gap between what a joke officially means and what sticks in the audience's memory is the core problem with Family Guy's approach to racial racial and ethnic humor across its entire run. The show builds in corrections. It has Peter learn things. It has Brian deliver liberal speeches. It has characters acknowledge that the behavior they are watching is wrong. And then the audience walks away humming the song about needing a Jew, and the lesson gets left in the room. The lawsuit is the last piece of this story, and it is genuinely strange. On October 3rd, 2007, a publishing company called The Bourne Company, which owned the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox and Seth MacFarlane over I Need a Jew. The lawsuit claimed the parody harmed the value and reputation of the original song. The argument was that by attaching offensive lyrics to a beloved melody, the show had done damage to the original song's standing. A federal judge named Deborah Vatz ruled in March 2009 that the song was a parody and therefore protected. The lawsuit failed. Family Guy won. But the existence of the lawsuit points at something real. The song was offensive enough that a publisher felt it had a legal case. The song was ambiguous enough in its intent, satire versus anti-Semitism, that the question went to federal court. And when the dust settled, the song was legal, the episode was available, and the conversation moved on. There is one more small fact worth noting, because it is the kind of detail that sits quietly in the background of this episode and rewards attention. The character Chris Griffin is voiced by Seth Green. Seth Green is Jewish. In the episode, his character is dragged by his father to a Las Vegas synagogue to be converted to Judaism so that he will automatically become good with money. The actor voicing the character is a member of the religion the episode is built around, performing a scene in which that religion's adherents are stereotyped as financially gifted by nature. The show seems aware of this, given that it was noted in production materials as an ironic casting coincidence. Whether it makes the episode more self-aware or simply more tangled is a question the show does not answer. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is not the most extreme thing Family Guy ever did with racial or ethnic material. It is not even the most extreme thing the show did with Jewish material. The moment in 3 Acts of God, involving crowds of Jewish characters picking up pennies, which the Anti-Defamation League publicly described as outrageous, probably earns that distinction. But this episode is the one Fox deemed too dangerous to air. The one that required 4 years and a channel change before audiences could see it. The one that went to court over a song. It is the episode that most clearly shows the gap between what the show thought it was doing and what the network calculated might actually land. Fox sat on it. Adult Swim aired it. Fox eventually broadcast it, censored. A judge ruled it legal. The conversation moved on. Except, of course, it never really moved on. Because the pattern this episode established, offensive content dressed in the clothes of satire, defended by pointing to who wrote it and what the character learns by the end, would repeat itself across the show's next 20 plus years, just with different targets. Some of those targets got much less careful treatment than this one did. One of them involved a Boston Marathon joke that aired 5 weeks before 2 real bombs went off at the Boston Marathon. That episode did not get hidden for 4 years. It got pulled from streaming the week after the bombing. And the reason it was pulled had everything to do with the fact that it had depicted a terrorist attack, that it had depicted the terrorist as Muslim, and that the show had once again confused something lazy for something daring. Section 3, quote 3 __. The episode that got pulled after a real bombing. Season 11, episode 15, 2013. There is a specific kind of uncomfortable that happens when a joke stops being a joke because the real world caught up to it. Most of the time, Family Guy's offensive content existed in a sealed bubble, something that made people angry, something that advocacy groups wrote letters about, something that generated bad press for a news cycle and then faded. The show kept going, the sponsors stayed, the ratings held, and the conversation moved on until the next time something crossed a line. Turban Cowboy did not get that grace period. The episode aired on March 17th, 2013 on Fox. It was written by Artie Johan and Sean Rees and directed by Joe Vo. By the standards of what Family Guy was doing in season 11, it was a fairly typical piece of work. Peter gets into a new hobby, something goes wrong, there are cutaway gags, the plot resolves, end credits. The hobby this time was skydiving. Peter discovers he loves it, keeps doing it despite Lois asking him to stop, and eventually lands in a hospital in Las Vegas after one of his jumps goes badly. In the hospital, he meets a man named Mahmoud, who is Muslim. They become friends. happens. Peter decides to learn about Islam. He considers converting. And then, in the third act, it turns out that Mahmoud is the leader of a terrorist cell planning to blow up the Quahog Bridge. That is the plot. A Muslim man who befriends Peter turns out to be a terrorist. This was the story Family Guy chose to tell in 2013, 12 years after the September 11th attacks, in a media environment where Muslim and Arab Americans had spent over a decade dealing with the assumption that their religion made them dangerous. The show was aware, at least partially, that this was a loaded choice. The awareness shows up in a single scene where Joe Swanson tells Quagmire that not all Muslims are terrorists and that every community has people who do terrible things. That is the show's disclaimer. One scene, one character, about 30 seconds of screen time in a 22-minute episode whose entire story depends on the Muslim character being exactly what Joe says not all Muslims are. This structure, offensive premise, brief corrective statement, return to offensive premise, is not unique to this episode. It is a Family Guy habit that runs across many of its more controversial episodes. The show says the thing, then has a character note that the thing is wrong, then keeps doing the thing. Critics gave this move a name. TV Tropes documented it as a broken Aesop, a lesson that the episode itself contradicts. The lesson in Turban Cowboy is that not all Muslims are terrorists. The story in Turban Cowboy is that this particular Muslim, the only Muslim character with any significant screen time, is a terrorist. The lesson and the story cancel each other out. And what the audience is left with is the image of a Muslim man recruiting Peter into a bombing plot. Kevin McFarland, writing for the AV Club, gave the episode a D. His review contained a line that captured the problem precisely. He wrote that Turban Cowboy feels like an episode made in 2002 and left on the shelf for a decade, completely unaware of just how uniformly Middle Eastern characters are depicted as terrorists. This was not a fringe take. Carter Dotson at TV Fanatic gave the episode 2.5 stars out of 5. The episode sits at a 6.7 on IMDb, which, by Family Guy standards, is below average. Even people who were not especially concerned about the representation issues tended to agree that it was not a particularly good episode. Religious studies scholar A. David Lewis, who is himself a convert to Islam, wrote a detailed response to the episode after it aired. He made a specific argument that is worth spending time on. He said the episode was not just offensive, it was lazy. He pointed out that there are genuinely funny things to say about Islam, that there are real contradictions and tensions within any major religion that a sharp comedy could explore. He said, Family Guy found none of them. Instead, it reached for the most obvious, most tired version of the Muslim as terrorist story, dressed it up with a few jokes about food and prayer customs, and called it an episode. He wrote that Turban Cowboy was a squandered opportunity for actual comedy, for actual commentary, for anything that might have made the episode worth the trouble it caused. The trouble it caused was enormous. Not because of the terrorism plot, but because of a cutaway gag. Cutaway gags are Family Guy's signature move. The story stops, the screen cuts to something completely unrelated to the plot, a joke happens, the story resumes. Some of them are the funniest things the show has ever done. Some of them are throwaway. The one in Turban Cowboy that became infamous showed Peter driving a car through a crowd of runners at the Boston Marathon. The joke was about Peter winning the race by eliminating the competition through vehicular violence. It was a few seconds long. It had nothing to do with the episode's main plot about Mahmoud and the bridge bombing. It was just a cutaway. On April 15th, 2013, 29 days after the episode aired, two brothers named Jahar and Tamerlan Sarnayev detonated 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. Over 260 people were injured, many of them seriously. It remains one of the most devastating terrorist attacks on American soil since September 11th, 2001. The bombers were Muslim. Fox acted within days. The network removed Turban Cowboy from its website. Amazon pulled it. Hulu pulled it. Fox issued a statement saying it had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. The decision was made quietly and quickly, without a lot of public explanation, because the explanation was obvious. The episode depicted a Muslim man as a terrorist planning a bombing. The episode contained a separate joke about killing people at the Boston Marathon, and then a Muslim man, 2 Muslim men, bombed the Boston Marathon. The combination was too direct to ignore and too uncomfortable to defend. What happened next made things worse. Someone on the internet took the Boston Marathon cutaway from Turban Cowboy and edited it together with a separate scene from the same episode in which Peter detonates remote-controlled bombs. The edited video was made to look like a single, continuous clip, creating the impression that Family Guy had predicted or depicted the Boston Marathon bombing in specific detail before it happened. This video was not real. It was constructed from two separate scenes that had nothing to do with each other, but it spread widely and rapidly, helped along by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who posted it on his website InfoWars and shared it on social media, claiming the show had somehow predicted the attack. The video was fake. Multiple news organizations confirmed this within days. The scenes were from different moments in the episode, edited together to create something that did not exist in the actual broadcast. But the fact that the fake video spread as far and as fast as it did tells you something about how close the episode's content was to the real event. Close enough that the manipulation was believable to a lot of people, at least for a few days. Turban Cowboy stayed off American streaming services for almost a decade. It returned to Hulu in September 2022, nearly 9.5 years after it was pulled. It never fully returned to American broadcast television in that time. It remained available in the United Kingdom on ITV2 and later on Disney Plus in the UK and Canada, regions that made their own decisions about whether to keep it in rotation. But in America, it was effectively gone, which made it, alongside Partial Terms of Endearment, one of only 2 Family Guy episodes to be removed from the American streaming landscape for an extended period. Now here is the thing that gets missed in most discussions of this episode. The Boston Marathon cutaway, as horrifying as its timing was not actually the worst thing about Turban Cowboy. The cutaway was a random joke that happened to intersect with a tragedy in a way nobody could have predicted. That is genuinely just bad luck of a particular kind. What is not bad luck? What is a deliberate choice made in a writer's room by people who had access to 12 years of post-September 11th cultural context is the decision to make every Muslim character in the episode either a suspicious stereotype or a terrorist. Think about how the episode constructs Mahmoud. When Peter's friends first meet him at the bar, Mahmoud will not drink alcohol and will not look at other women, which the show presents as socially strange rather than simply different. Peter is drawn to Islam partly because of the way Mahmoud's wife behaves around her husband, obediently, submissively, in a way Peter finds appealing because he wishes Lois would act that way. This is the show's explanation for why Peter converts. He sees a religion that appears to keep women obedient and decides he wants in. The portrayal of Islamic marriage here is not a careful or nuanced one. It is a stereotype about Muslim women having no independence, used as a punchline about Peter wanting a more controllable wife. Then Mahmoud turns out to be a terrorist, so in one episode, Family Guy deploys 2 of the most common and harmful stereotypes about Muslim people: that their treatment of women is backward and oppressive, and that their religion produces violent extremists, and packages both of them inside a plot that also tries, briefly, to say that not all Muslims are like this. The show wants credit for the disclaimer without doing the work the disclaimer requires. It wants to be seen as thoughtful without actually being thoughtful. What it ends up being is exactly what McFarland said in his review. Something that would not have felt out of place airing in 2002, when the country was still in the most raw and frightened phase of its post-September 11th panic, and when Muslim and Arab Americans were experiencing discrimination and violence at rates that civil rights organizations described as a crisis. By 2013, that crisis had not ended. It had simply become less visible to people who were not experiencing it. Family Guy made an episode that treated Muslim people the same way American media had been treating them for over a decade, added a corrective sentence in the 3rd act, and called it done. A. David Lewis made one more point in his response that deserves attention. He noted that the episode tried to use Peter's friend Brian as a voice of moral clarity. Brian congratulates Peter at one point for having a Muslim friend, in a way that is meant to read as liberal and open-minded. But Lewis pointed out that Brian's congratulation is self-important, almost condescending, more about Brian being seen as the kind of person who celebrates diversity than about any genuine engagement with Mahmoud as a person. The AV Club review made the same observation, noting that whenever the show portrays Brian as desperate to be seen as morally superior, it is actually funny, but funny in the wrong direction. Funny because Brian's open-mindedness is as shallow as Peter's ignorance, which means the episode's designated voice of reason is also a joke, which means there is no actual center to the episode's moral logic. This is the structure Family Guy returns to again and again when it handles race and religion. Peter is bigoted and wrong. Brian is enlightened, and performatively so. The show presents the bigotry as something to laugh at, and the enlightenment as something to slightly mock as well, which creates the impression that the show itself exists above both positions, looking down at everyone with knowing detachment. But what that position actually does is let the show have it both ways. It gets to air the stereotype and also get credit for acknowledging the stereotype is a stereotype. It gets to tell the terrorist joke and also get credit for the single scene where Joe says not all Muslims are terrorists. The show collects credit for awareness it does not fully earn. Turban Cowboy aired. Real bombs went off. off. The episode disappeared from American streaming for almost a decade. A fake video spread claiming the show had predicted the attack. None of this changed how the show approached Muslim characters or Arab characters in subsequent episodes. There was no internal reckoning documented publicly, no statement from the writer's room about reconsidering how Islam gets depicted in Quahog. The episode came back to Hulu in 2022, and the show kept going. What makes this episode significant is not just the timing. Plenty of creative works have had the terrible misfortune of being too close to real tragedies in ways nobody could have anticipated. What makes this episode significant is the decade plus of cultural context that was available to the writers when they made it, and the choice they made anyway. They had everything they needed to do something genuinely interesting with a Muslim character in Quahog. They had over a decade of national conversation about Islamophobia, about the human cost of stereotypes, about what it meant to keep portraying an entire religion as a factory for violence. They sat in a writer's room with all of that available to them, and they wrote a character named Mahmoud, who turns out to be recruiting Peter for a bombing. The episode was lazy, as Lewis said, but lazy is not innocent. Lazy, when the lazy choice is to make the Muslim man the terrorist, is a choice with consequences. And those consequences are what happen when the show that made the choice loses control of the story. When the real world stops cooperating with the premise that this is all just jokes, that none of this sticks, that the audience knows the difference between a cartoon and a statement. 29 days is how long it took for the real world to stop cooperating. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while Turban Cowboy is the clearest example of Family Guy's racial content colliding with an actual event, it is not the only time the show made choices about black characters that deserved harder scrutiny than they got. Because alongside the episodes that generated press and controversy, there were quieter episodes. Episodes that did not make international news. Episodes that critics mostly shrugged at, that were doing something just as worth examining. One of them was supposed to be the show grappling honestly with race in America. It had a musical number. It had a touching moment where Peter finally understood something about what a black man experiences. And it still, somehow, managed to make the black character the one who needed to learn a lesson about his own racism. Section 4. Cleveland Brown as passive target. Quote 5, and the diffidence pattern. Season 12, 2014. There is a difference between a character who is calm and a character who is broken. Family Guy spent the better part of 15 years presenting Cleveland Brown as the former, while actually writing him as the latter. And the show managed this because the gap between those two things is easy to miss when you are watching an animated comedy, and the jokes are moving fast enough that you do not have time to stop and ask why the black character never pushes back. Cleveland's defining trait from his first appearance in the 1999 pilot was patience. He was slow to anger. He was measured. He was the friend who tried to talk Peter out of bad ideas, rather than the friend who egged him on. In the early seasons, this read as a kind of quiet dignity. Cleveland was smarter than the situation he was usually in, more aware of consequences, more willing to think before acting. Compared to Quagmire, who operated on pure impulse and left damage everywhere he went, and compared to Joe, whose aggression was always simmering just below the surface, Cleveland's calmness felt like a genuine character trait. He was the steady one, the reasonable one. But there is a version of reasonable that tips over into something else. There is a version of steady that stops being a personality and starts being a pattern of not being allowed to respond. And somewhere across the show's long run, Cleveland crossed that line without the show acknowledging it had happened. The bathtub gag is the clearest physical expression of this. It runs throughout the show's entire history, and the setup never changes. Peter does something, usually something reckless, usually something that involves the structural destruction of nearby property, and the wall of Cleveland's house collapses, revealing Cleveland in his upstairs bathtub. The floor tilts, the bathtub slides. Cleveland falls, screaming his string of no's all the way to the ground. The tub shatters. End of gag. The show moves on. This happens over and over. It happens so many times that it becomes the thing Cleveland is most known for, more than anything he says or does or believes. He is the man whose bathtub falls. He is the house that gets knocked down. He is the target of Peter's destruction so reliably and so repeatedly that it eventually became a running joke about itself. The show started acknowledging within episodes that this kept happening to Cleveland, which is the animated equivalent of patting yourself on the back for something you have not examined. In the pilot episode of The Cleveland Show, the bathtub gag is literally the final straw that convinces Cleveland to leave Quahog. He falls one more time, lands in the wreckage of his own bathroom, and decides he is done. He moves away. The show follows him to Virginia. And then, 4 seasons later, The Cleveland Show was canceled, and Cleveland came back. The episode that marked his return aired in season 12 and was titled He's Black. The title is a play on the phrase, he's back, with the word black black inserted to signal that the episode knows Cleveland is black and considers that fact worth making a joke about before anything else happens. The exclamation point makes the joke louder. The episode announces its own awareness of race in the title, and then uses that awareness as cover for what it is actually going to do, which is subject Cleveland to a series of racially charged moments while he responds to none of them. The episode opens with Cleveland and his family returning to Quahog after the end of his spinoff. His friends welcome him back at the bar. Quagmire's first notable contribution to the reunion is the observation that it must be strange for Cleveland and his family to move, and not because of a hurricane. This is a joke that uses the displacement of black families during Hurricane Katrina, a real catastrophe that genuinely destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, disproportionately black people, and scattered entire communities across the country, as a punchline about Cleveland coming home. Cleveland does not respond to this. He does not say anything. He does not look at Quagmire with even a trace of irritation. The show moves on. Later in the episode, Peter decides he wants to spend time with Cleveland, but Lois has told him that is not allowed. Peter's solution is to pull Cleveland over while dressed as a police officer. This is a scenario with a specific and painful history in America. Black men being stopped by police for no legitimate reason, being subjected to the authority of law enforcement simply by existing in public, and the show uses it as a setup for Peter to assault Cleveland. Peter, pretending to have police authority over his friend, physically attacks him. Cleveland takes the beating. He does not fight back. He does not demand an explanation. He accepts it as part of the situation, and the show moves on. The car crash comes later. Peter crashes a car carrying both of them deliberately as a plan to get their wives talking again. The crash hospitalizes Cleveland. Peter walks away without injury because, as he mentions in the hospital room, he forgot that only his side of the car had airbags. He says this casually, as though the information is mildly interesting rather than evidence of something genuinely disturbing about how he values Cleveland's safety versus his own. Cleveland, from his hospital bed, continues to be Peter's friend. The episode resolves. The relationship continues unchanged. A writer named Kyle Zielinski published a detailed analysis of this episode and the patterns it reveals. The argument he makes is not complicated, but it is precise. He writes that through Cleveland, Family Guy consistently sends the message that black people in America will not stand up for themselves, that they will absorb mistreatment quietly, that they can be hurt and insulted and they will remain in the room, will remain friendly, will continue to show up. He documents the specific moments, the Katrina joke, the false police stop, the assault, the car crash, and shows that Cleveland's response to each of them is the same: silence, acceptance, continuation. This is worth thinking about carefully, because the show has a ready defense for it, and the defense is not entirely wrong. The defense is that Peter treats everyone badly. Peter is the show's designated disaster. He hurts his wife, his children, his dog, his neighbors, all of his friends. Joe gets put in dangerous situations. Quagmire gets consequences he did not anticipate. Brian gets treated with contempt regularly. The show is unkind to almost everybody in it, and pointing at Cleveland as specifically victimized could be read as selectively noticing the black characters suffering, while ignoring that the white characters suffer too. But the defense misses something. What happens to Joe and Quagmire and Brian is generally met with a response. Joe gets angry. Quagmire pushes back. Brian argues, sometimes at length. The show allows these characters to have reactions to what is done to them. Cleveland, across the majority of his appearances, does not get that. His patience is not a choice the show lets him make. It is a condition the show imposes on him. And that distinction matters, because a character who chooses to stay calm in difficult situations is doing something active. A character who simply does not react because the show has decided he will not react is a different thing entirely. He is not calm. He is just not allowed to be anything else. The academic analysis of Family Guy's racial content makes this point in a broader way. The thesis, published through a university in New York, argues that the show's portrayal of Cleveland reflects patterns rooted in a long history of how black characters have been written by white writers for predominantly white audiences. Patterns in which black characters exist to serve the story's needs, absorb its discomfort, and provide moments of contrast against white characters who are allowed fuller, messier, more reactive inner lives. These are not new observations about American entertainment. They are documented tendencies that run across decades of film and television. What makes Family Guy worth examining through this lens is that the show presents itself as aware of exactly these issues. It has characters acknowledge racism. It has plot lines that critique prejudice. It has the vocabulary of social awareness built into its dialogue. And then it writes Cleveland the way it writes Cleveland. And the gap between what the show says and what the show does becomes impossible to ignore. There is also the matter of the Cleveland show, and what happened to Cleveland's character when he got his own series versus what he was allowed allowed to be when he came back to Family Guy. On his own show, Cleveland changed significantly. He became louder, more expressive, more willing to lead. He made up words, turned conversations into musical moments, pursued schemes with the kind of energy that Peter Griffin usually monopolizes on Family Guy. He was, by the accounts of people who watched both shows, a fundamentally different character on his own show than he was as a supporting player in Quahog. He had room to breathe. He had room to react. He had room to be wrong in ways that were his own fault, rather than simply absorbing the consequences of Peter's wrongness. When he came back to Family Guy after the Cleveland show ended, that version of Cleveland did not come back with him. The fan wiki that documents Family Guy canon notes this directly, observing that after the Cleveland show's cancellation and Cleveland's return to Family Guy, he lost much of the personality developed during his time as a lead character. His only real trait, the wiki notes, was being black. Everything he did was either a modern stereotype about black people or an older, more harmful one. The character who had spent 4 seasons becoming something more complex was reduced back to his original function, the calm black friend who takes what comes and keeps showing up. John McWhorter, the writer who called the Cleveland show basically Family Guy in blackface when it premiered, was making an argument about the spin-off's reliance on racial stereotypes as its primary source of comedy. But his phrasing also points at something true about Family Guy itself. The phrase blackface refers to a specific performance tradition in American history where white performers painted their faces dark and depicted black people as buffoons, as simple-minded, as childlike, as incapable of real dignity. The tradition was deeply harmful, and its harm did not disappear when the explicit practice faded. It survived in the assumptions that white writers brought to black characters, the assumption that patience was the same as simplicity, that calm was the same as passivity, that the absence of complaint was the same as happiness. Cleveland Brown is not a buffoon. He is not written as stupid. He is, in many individual moments, the smartest person in the conversation. But over the full length of his time on Family Guy, he is written as someone to whom things happen, rather than someone who makes things happen. He is the bathtub that falls. He is the friend who gets assaulted and wakes up in the hospital and shows up the next week unchanged. He is the character whose blackness is available to the show as a joke source, without the show ever being asked, by anyone in a position to demand it, to treat that blackness as something more than material. Mike Henry sat behind the microphone for 21 years doing the voice. The writers sat at their desks and wrote the scripts. The network put the show on the air. Millions of people watched. And Cleveland Brown took his bathtub falls, accepted his beatings, sat in his hospital beds, and kept showing up for Peter Griffin. The pattern is not subtle once you see it. It just requires stopping the tape long enough to ask why the same thing keeps happening to the same character, and why that character's response is always the same. __quote _6 __. What makes all of this harder to look away from is that the show was not only doing it with Cleveland. At the same time that Cleveland was being written as a passive target in Quahog, the show was building an entire episode around the idea that black people telling white people they are being racist is itself a form of racism. It was an episode with a musical number. It had a moment that the show clearly thought was touching, and it got a D+ from the critics. Because what it actually did was spend 22 minutes making racist jokes and then try to pretend it had said something worth saying. Section 5, Quote 7, The Racial Reversal That Didn't Work. Season 12, Episode 18, 2014. The episode opens with a news anchor making a joke about a child dying from playing video games for 51 hours straight. The anchor clarifies that the child was gay, as though this is relevant additional information. This is in the first 30 seconds. By the time Baby Got Black gets to its actual plot, the one about race, the one that gave the episode its title, the one that critics and audiences would spend the next week picking apart, the show has already told you exactly what kind of episode it is going to be. It is going to be the kind that reaches for whatever is nearest and pulls the trigger without asking whether the target deserves it. Baby Got Black aired on April 27th, 2014. It is a season 12 episode, production code BACX-15, and it was written during a period when Family Guy had settled into a rhythm of provocative subject matter treated with varying degrees of care. Some episodes from this era are genuinely sharp. This one, according to every significant critic who reviewed it, was not. The AV Club gave it a D+. The reviewer, Eric Thurm, described it as the rare episode of the show that seems like it might have had a tiny impulse to say something interesting, and falls totally and utterly flat. The setup takes about 7 minutes to arrive. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire make a bet about who can stay awake the longest. Peter wins after nearly 3 days of hallucinations and increasingly strange behavior. He uses his winnings to take the family to dinner at a restaurant called Sporty's. At the restaurant, Chris bumps into a classmate named Pam. They hit it off immediately. They start talking. There is a clear attraction. Peter is relaxed about this, which is unusual for Peter. Lois is nervous. The dinner goes well enough. Then it is revealed that Pam's father is Jerome. Jerome had appeared in Family Guy before. He was introduced in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, where he was a bartender at the Drunken Clam and an old friend of Lois's with a romantic history between them. In that episode, he was portrayed as confident, warm, and generally likable. He had no particular hostility toward anyone. He was, by the standards of the show's supporting cast, a reasonably drawn character. In Baby Got Black, Jerome's personality appears to have been significantly adjusted to serve the episode's plot. He is suddenly, and without any prior setup, deeply hostile to the idea of his daughter dating a white boy. He forbids the relationship. He tells Peter at the bar that Chris cannot see Pam anymore, and when Peter calls him out on this, Jerome delivers the episode's most discussed line. He says, "Black people can't be racist. We can be way sexist, but we ain't racist." This line is the center of the episode, the thing everything else is built around, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The claim that black people cannot be racist is a position that has existed in certain political conversations, usually framed around the argument that racism requires both prejudice and institutional power, and that black people in America have historically lacked the institutional power that would make prejudice toward white people function the same way as racism directed at black people. That is a real intellectual argument made by real scholars. It is also a genuinely contested argument that many people, including many black scholars and thinkers, disagree with. Family Guy does not engage with any of that. Jerome says the line, the show gets its joke, and then the rest of the episode is built around proving Jerome wrong by making him the episode's primary source of racial prejudice. The show takes a phrase associated with a complex social argument, uses it as a punchline, and then structures the entire narrative to discredit the person who said it. Jerome, the black character, is the racist in Baby Got Black. Peter, the white character who has spent 12 seasons making racially offensive remarks without consequence, is the one who eventually delivers the corrective lesson. The process by which this happens is the episode's most revealing structural choice. Peter decides to win Jerome over by demonstrating that white people have made valuable contributions to the world. He does this through a musical number called Thank the Whites. The song lists things Peter believes white people deserve credit for, including Breaking Bad, the cast of Friends, Tara Reid, Frisbee sports, fancy coffee, energy-efficient lights, Ray-Ban sunglasses, and what the lyrics describe as leggy blondes with tiny asses. Peter sings this to Jerome as an argument for why Jerome should allow his daughter to date a white boy. Jerome's response, delivered as the song ends, is, "That song only made me hate white people even more." This is the only genuinely funny moment in the episode's racial material, and it works because Jerome's reaction is the correct one. The song is not an argument. It is a list of random cultural products that have no logical connection to whether interracial relationships are acceptable. Peter thinks he is making a case. He is not making a case. Jerome correctly identifies that Peter has said nothing worth responding to, and his contempt for the song is the appropriate reaction to a deeply strange attempt at persuasion. But the show does not let Jerome keep being right. The episode needs him to learn a lesson, so it constructs a situation where Jerome's prejudice is shown to mirror Peter's in a way that forces him to reconsider. Peter and Jerome drive around together looking for Chris and Pam after the two teenagers run away to a motel. During this drive, they are pulled over by a police officer who harasses Jerome without cause. Peter witnesses this. Peter, who has apparently never thought about what it is like to be black and pulled over by police for no reason, has a moment of recognition. He becomes sympathetic to Jerome's experience. Jerome, softened by Peter's response, admits that most of his anger comes from needing to protect Pam rather than from genuine hatred of white people, and that he actually likes Peter. This is the moment the AV Club called a teaching moment that gets just a few seconds of the episode, and those few seconds are genuinely interesting. The image of Jerome and Peter being pulled over together, with Jerome quietly noting that this happens to him all the time, is the only moment in the episode that approaches something true about the reality of being black in America. Peter's dawning understanding of what that experience means is, for a few seconds, handled with something approaching sincerity, and then they arrive at the motel and find Chris and Pam making out, and Peter's response to this is to tell Chris that he needs to stay away from black people from now on. He says this sincerely. He means it as a lesson he has taken from Jerome's behavior. Jerome, hearing Peter articulate his own racial separatism back at him, realizes he has been the mirror of the thing he hates. Pam looks at her father and asks him if that is the lesson he wants her to learn. The episode wants this to be its emotional payoff. Jerome seeing himself in Peter's words, recognizing that his protectiveness has curdled into the same thing he has suffered from, letting Chris and Pam be together. This is supposed to be the episode saying something real about how prejudice reproduces itself across all groups. The message, if you squint at it in the right light, is that racial separation causes harm, regardless of who is practicing it. The problem is everything surrounding that message. The academic analysis, published through SUNY Cortland, identifies this episode directly and makes an argument that the paper describes as the central failure of Family Guy's approach to racial satire. The argument is that the episode flirts with a real critique of racial prejudice. In this case, the idea that protectiveness can become its own form of the thing you fear, but that the comedy used to get there relies entirely on exaggerated stereotypes about black characters. Jerome's sudden hostility in this episode, his claim that black people cannot be racist, his aggressive protectiveness over his daughter, these are not a nuanced portrait of a man shaped by legitimate grievance. They are, as the paper notes, a deployment of the scary black father stereotype, the figure whose anger at white people is the obstacle the plot needs to overcome. The paper also identifies a broader pattern in how Family Guy handles these episodes. The show, it argues, consistently places the burden of learning on black characters rather than white ones. In Baby Got Black, Jerome is the one who has to change. Peter's racism, which is present throughout the episode, which includes the Thank the Whites song and ends with him telling his son to stay away from black people, is treated as a teaching tool for Jerome, rather than as a problem that requires its own examination. Peter does not learn anything about himself. He has a moment of sympathy for Jerome during the police stop, but this does not translate into any shift in how Peter thinks or behaves. By the end of the episode, Peter's racial worldview is functionally unchanged. Jerome's is not. The show frames this as Jerome growing. You could also frame it as the episode deciding that the black character's prejudice is the problem that needs solving, while the white character's prejudice is the narrative device that helps solve it. Brian Griffin is in this episode too, and what he does is worth noting separately. When the Griffins first have dinner with Jerome and Pam, Brian observes that it is about time people of color broke bread at this table. Brian says this as though it is a meaningful and progressive statement, as though he is noting something important about inclusion and diversity. The AV Club review flags this moment specifically, noting that Family Guy and its sister shows have done some successful and sharp things when they portray Brian as so transparently desperate to be seen as morally superior that the self-importance becomes the joke. In this moment, Brian is exactly that. He is announcing his own open-mindedness so loudly that the announcement becomes an admission of its absence. He is congratulating himself for having a black dinner guest. He is not talking to Jerome. He is performing for an audience that only he can see. The trouble is that Brian is supposed to be the show's moral compass. He is the character who most consistently articulates liberal positions, who most frequently calls out prejudice when he sees it, who most reliably argues for the more thoughtful response to whatever situation the episode has created. When the show makes Brian's enlightenment as hollow as Peter's bigotry, it is making a choice about where the show itself stands. It is positioning itself above both positions, above the racism and above the performative anti-racism, looking down at all of it with a kind of knowing detachment that implies the show is too smart to be caught taking a side. But not taking a side is a side. And when the episode ends with Jerome having learned his lesson and Peter having learned nothing, the show has taken a side, whether it intended to or not. There is one more detail about this episode that deserves attention, and it comes at the very end. In the final scene, Pam reveals to Jerome in the closing moments that Chris dumped her after seeing her body because he was only trying to have sex with her. This is confirmed in the episode's credits sequence. The romantic connection between Chris and Pam, the thing the episode has spent 22 minutes treating as worth protecting and fighting for and ultimately celebrating, is revealed as having been purely physical on Chris's end. He did not like Pam. He wanted to sleep with her. Jerome's fear that his daughter was being seen as a novelty, not as a person, turns out to have been correct. The show presents this as a joke, a closing gag, something to end the episode on, a sting in the tail. But what it actually does is validate every concern Jerome expressed about why white boys pursue black girls, and then ensure that the episode's lesson, that Jerome was wrong to be suspicious, that his protectiveness was the problem, that racial separation causes harm, has been completely undercut by its own ending. The episode tells Jerome he was wrong, and then the episode proves he was right. And it treats this contradiction as funny, rather than as something it should have noticed before the final credits. riots. Eric Thurm at the AV Club described the ending as the rare episode trying to enforce a traditional sappy ending on 20 minutes of bad racist jokes, even if the jokes were directed at everyone. He noted it was not a good look. He was being polite. The episode received a 2.1 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic. Just over 4 million people watched it. Those 4 million people saw an episode that spent its first 7 minutes on an unrelated sleep deprivation bet, spent its next 15 minutes doing racial jokes that the AV Club described as bad, give a few seconds to a genuinely moving moment about police harassment, delivered a corrective lesson aimed entirely at the black character, and closed on a joke that made the lesson meaningless. And the show filed it under the category of episodes that grappled with race in America. None of this happened in a vacuum. Baby Got Black aired in April 2014. Trayvon Martin had been killed by George Zimmerman in February 2012. The not guilty verdict in Zimmerman's trial had come in July 2013, 9 months before this episode aired. The protest movement that would eventually become Black Lives Matter was forming in real time. Family Guy's answer to this cultural moment was an episode in which the black character learns not to be racist, set to a song about the greatness of Breaking Bad and Leggy Blondes. And yet, the conversation about the show's approach to race continued to focus mostly on individual episodes, individual jokes, individual moments that crossed a line. Almost nobody was asking the structural question, not just what any single episode did, but what the show's entire system for handling race was built to do, who it protected, who it required to change, who got to stay the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That structural question connects directly to the character of Mort Goldman, who had been in Family Guy from the very beginning and who was doing something different from Cleveland or Jerome, not absorbing punishment, not being written as the one who needs to learn, but being used as the show's primary vessel for Jewish stereotypes across its entire run, decade after decade, in ways the Anti-Defamation League eventually described as outrageous, and in ways the show somehow continued to defend as satire. Section 6, Quote 9, Native American Stereotypes, from Episode 6. Most shows take a few seasons to reveal what they really are. They spend the early episodes finding their voice, figuring out their characters, testing which jokes land and which ones fall flat. By the time a show starts making its most revealing choices, the ones that tell you what the writers actually think is funny, what they are willing to do for a laugh, whose dignity they consider fair game, it is usually well into its run. The audience is already attached. The show has built enough goodwill that individual moments of ugliness get absorbed into a larger impression of something mostly harmless. Family Guy did not wait that long. The 6th episode ever broadcast, the 6th out of what would eventually become over 400, is the one where the Griffins visit a Native American casino, and the show deploys nearly every available stereotype about indigenous people in the space of about 20 minutes. This was May 9th, 1999. The show had been on the air for less than 2 months. It had not yet established whether it was going to be sharp or lazy, whether its offensive content was going to serve something larger or simply be the point. Episode 6 answered that question clearly, and the answer was not encouraging. The episode is called The Sun Also Draws, and its main story is actually about Chris and his relationship with Peter. Chris has been ejected from the Youth Scouts, an organization he hated anyway, because what he really wants to do is draw, rather than participate in outdoor activities. Peter, who does not yet understand this about his son, decides the family needs to drive to Manhattan to complain to Scout headquarters and get Chris reinstated. This is a reasonable Family Guy setup. Peter misunderstanding what his child actually needs and charging toward a bad solution with complete confidence. The Chris and Peter story, when it eventually gets told, has some genuine warmth to it. Peter goes on what the episode calls a vision quest, hallucinates in the wilderness, and ends up talking to the Fonz from Happy Days, who serves as his spirit guide and helps him understand that Chris just wants to draw. Peter accepts this. He and Chris bond. The relationship subplot is actually sweet. None of that is the problem. The problem is what happens on the way to Manhattan. Peter needs to use the bathroom. The family sees a sign for a casino. They stop, and the show spends a significant portion of its running time inside a Native American casino that is depicted as a series of teepees staffed by people in feathered headdresses and loincloths with name tags bearing names the episode treats as inherently funny. The casino is named Geronimo's Palace. Geronimo was a real person, a leader of the Chiricahua Apache people who became one of the most famous figures in the history of indigenous resistance to the United States government. Using his name as the title of a cartoon casino staffed by stereotype props is not satire. It is just use. Lois, who is presented as the reasonable member of the Griffin family, becomes addicted to video poker and loses loses the family car. This happens quickly and without much setup. The joke is that Lois, who is usually sensible, falls apart in a casino, which is its own kind of lazy. But the consequences of her gambling land the family in a negotiation with the casino's tribal elders, and this is where the episode's choices become most clear. Peter decides to claim Native American heritage in order to get the car back. He announces that his great-grandfather's name was Chief Grand Cherokee. The elders are skeptical. They tell Peter that if he wants to prove his heritage, he must go on a vision quest, venture into the wilderness without food, water, or shoes until he becomes one with nature and finds his guiding spirit. Peter agrees. He and Chris go into the woods together. What happens next? The Chris and Peter bonding story, the Fonz as spirit guide, Peter finally hearing what his son has been trying to tell him, is the heart of the episode and the part that works. It is also, and this matters, built on top of a ritual practice from indigenous culture that the show presents as a stunt, a con, a fake thing the elders invented to get rid of Peter. The episode reveals later that the elders told Lois the vision quest was a sham, that they sent Peter into the woods knowing he would not actually find anything, expecting him to fail and give up. The joke is that Peter sincerely experiences the vision quest anyway, which surprises the elders and shames them into giving back the car. The episode intends this as a subversion. It is trying to use the vision quest not as a mockery of indigenous spiritual practice, but as a genuine thing that Peter accidentally stumbles into despite the elders' cynicism. The Fonz as a spirit guide is absurd, yes, but the absurdity is aimed at Peter rather than at the practice itself. And at the end of the episode, the show attempts something like a correction, a parody of the NBC public service announcement format where characters step forward to address stereotypes. Lois says that this particular tribe lost its way, but most Native Americans are proud, hard-working people who are true to their spiritual heritage. Stewie says something positive about Mexico. Meg says something about Sweden. Peter starts to say something about Canada, decides Canada sucks, and the correction does not appear for him. This ending is the show winking at itself. It is Family Guy acknowledging that the episode contains stereotypes, having a character briefly counter them, and then having Peter refuse to apply the correction to his own prejudice, which is a joke about Peter being Peter, but is also a structural signal about how much the show actually means the correction. The disclaimer is given and immediately undermined. The lesson is stated and immediately abandoned. This is the same move that shows up in Turban Cowboy's Joe Swanson speech, in Baby Got Black's final credits sequence, in episode after episode where the show gestures toward accountability and then walks away from it before the gesture is complete. Cultural critic Rob Schmidt, who ran a blog called Newspaper Rock, dedicated to documenting Native American representation in media, wrote about this episode in detail. His analysis identified specific problems beyond the general atmosphere of stereotype. The casino is built of teepees, which are a specific kind of portable dwelling associated with plains peoples like the Lakota and Comanche, nations that lived in the central grasslands of North America. The Griffins are driving from Rhode Island to New York City, which means the casino would logically be in Connecticut, where the real-world Foxwoods Resort Casino is operated by the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation. The Pequot people are from the northeastern woodlands. They did not live in teepees. The show grabbed the most visually recognizable symbol of Native American life it could find and placed it in a geographic context where it makes no sense. Because the goal was not accuracy, the goal was recognition. The audience needed to immediately understand that these characters were Native American, and the teepee was the fastest available signal. History and geography be damned. Schmidt also documented the names and costumes. Casino staff members are dressed in what the episode treats as traditional Native American clothing, feathers, loincloths, while wearing modern name tags, which is the show's attempt to have it both ways, to acknowledge the absurdity of the stereotype by making it slightly self-aware. But making a stereotype self-aware is not the same as interrogating it. The name tags do not critique the costumes. They just put a frame around them and assume the frame is enough. In a later piece, Schmidt addressed a separate Family Guy episode, Season 12's Life of Brian, that opens with a scene in an alternate timeline where Native Americans are in control of America after Stewie gave them guns during a trip to Jamestown in the past. In this alternate timeline, the Native Americans are depicted as hostile and violent, drawn with exaggerated physical features and speaking in a broken, simplified English associated with old Hollywood westerns rather than with any actual indigenous language or speech pattern. Schmidt noted that even when Family Guy was trying to subvert the stereotype, the episode gestures toward the idea that the characters are only speaking this way to fool strangers, that it is a performance rather than their natural speech. It still got fundamental things wrong, including placing teepees in Jamestown, Virginia, where no Plains nation ever lived. His broader argument was about frequency and consistency. He wrote that no other ethnic group gets treated by Family Family Guy the same way Native Americans do, not with the same sustained reliance on imagery that is over 150 years out of date, not with the same willingness to use real historical trauma as decoration. He made a specific comparison, showing every Native American as a Plains-era figure in feathers and buckskin is roughly equivalent to showing every Black American as a slave. Both choices take a real historical reality of oppression and make it the permanent, defining visual identity of an entire group of people, regardless of what those people's lives actually look like. An essay published on a university blog examining the Sun Also Draws episode specifically made a more sympathetic argument. The writer, a person of Native American descent who watched the episode while sick and initially found it deeply offensive, reconsidered after thinking about it more carefully. She concluded that some of the episode's choices were genuinely trying to subvert the stereotypes, the casino owners in suits making purely financial decisions, the vision quest being offered as a scam rather than as something the elders believed in, the ending's corrective format. She still maintained that the show should have been more careful, particularly with the teepee imagery and the costuming, which perpetuated stereotypes even when the writing was trying not to. Her conclusion was nuanced. The episode was an attempt that failed in specific, documentable ways. What is notable about this more charitable reading is where it agrees with the harsher one. Both the charitable and the critical reading arrive at the same place on the question of the costumes and the physical setting. The imagery was wrong. The teepees were wrong. The feathers and loincloths on casino staff were wrong. The willingness to grab the most recognizable visual signals of Native American identity and use them without asking whether they were accurate or appropriate was wrong. The disagreement is about intent and degree, not about whether harm was done. The episode also contains a line from Stewie that is worth noting. When the family first arrives at the casino and encounters the environment, Stewie calls the Native American characters stupid, greedy savages. Lois immediately corrects him. That is a terrible thing to say. The correction is there, but the line was written first. The word savage was chosen deliberately, put into Stewie's mouth, given to a character whose extreme statements are usually one of two things. Either the show making a joke at Stewie's expense because his worldview is monstrous, or the show using Stewie as a vehicle to say something it wanted to say but did not want to own. In this case, the episode corrects him quickly enough that it seems like the former, but the word was still written. It was still recorded. It was still in the episode that aired to whatever audience was watching Family Guy in May of 1999, most of whom were experiencing the show for the 6th time. There is something significant about the timing of this episode in the show's history that goes beyond its specific content. This was not a later season choice made by a writer's room that had established goodwill and was now testing boundaries. This was the 6th episode. This was Family Guy in its infancy, before it had been canceled and revived, before it had built the cultural presence that would eventually make it one of the longest-running animated shows in American television history. The choice to spend a significant portion of the 6th episode of your show at a Native American casino built of teepees and staffed by people in headdresses is a choice that tells you what the writers considered acceptable territory from the very beginning. It was not a mistake that crept in after the show got confident. It was present before the show had anything to be confident about. The academic essay about racism in Family Guy, published through a different university, makes a specific argument about this kind of early-run content. The writer cites a professor named LaCroix from the College of Charleston, who analyzed the episode and concluded that the satirization of Native Americans served no social purpose. It was not commenting on anything real about indigenous life, was not making an argument about American history or government policy toward Native nations, was not engaging with any of the actual complexities of Native American experience in modern America. It was simply using Native American people as the punchline of jokes. The teepee is the punchline. The name Chief Grand Cherokee is the punchline. The vision quest being a scam the elders invented is the punchline. None of it illuminates anything. It just reaches for a familiar image and squeezes it for laughs. LaCroix's argument, as the essay presents it, is that this kind of humor is not obviously racist in the way that more explicit forms of racism are obvious, which is precisely why it persists. It does not look like blackface. It does not use slurs. It operates through accumulated imagery. The teepee, the headdress, the broken English, the spiritual practice treated as a scam, that individually might be defended as shorthand or parody, but together add up to something that reinforces the idea that Native American people are a historical artifact, rather than a living population with a complex, contemporary existence. Family Guy went on to revisit Native American characters and settings multiple times across its run, and the pattern Schmidt identified held consistent across most of those appearances. The images stayed the same, the assumptions stayed the same, the corrective gesture gestures came at the end, when they came at all, and they were always brief enough to avoid interfering with the joke. The Sun Also Draws was episode 6. There were over 400 episodes still to come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What ran through all of them, the Cleveland episodes, the Mahmoud episode, the Mort Goldman episodes, the Native American Casino episode, was a consistent institutional posture that the show maintained, regardless of which specific group was at the center of any given week's content. That posture had a name. It had a defense. Seth MacFarlane had stated it publicly in interviews and had built it into the show's DNA from the earliest episodes. And in 2012, speaking to a reporter from The New Yorker, he said something about it that was more honest than anything the show itself had ever managed to be. What he said was not an apology. It was not a defense. It was something closer to a confession. And it is the key to understanding why the show managed to keep doing what it was doing for over 2 decades without ever being made to stop. Section 7. The Mort Goldman Problem. Anti-Semitic stereotypes running through a regular character. Most of the racial and ethnic content in Family Guy lives in individual episodes. It shows up, causes a reaction, gets pulled from streaming or defended in a press release, and eventually fades into the background noise of the show's long history of controversy. The Cleveland situation ran for 21 years, but it was structural and slow. It built across decades rather than arriving in a single identifiable moment. Turban Cowboy was one episode with one catastrophically bad piece of timing. Baby Got Black was one episode with a D+ review and a closing joke that destroyed its own lesson. Even the Native American Casino content, which appeared multiple times across the show's run, came in bursts rather than as a continuous presence. Mort Goldman is different. Mort Goldman has been in Family Guy since the beginning. He is not a main character, but he is not a one-off either. He is what television calls a recurring supporting character, meaning he shows up regularly enough across the show's run that the audience comes to know him, to recognize him, to understand his particular version of the world. He is the Griffin's neighbor. He is a pharmacist. He owns Goldman's Pharmacy in Quahog. He has a son named Neil who has an unrequited crush on Meg. He had a wife named Muriel who was killed in a later season episode. He is, by the standards of Family Guy's supporting cast, a well-established presence. He is also, by nearly every observable measure, a collection of anti-Semitic stereotypes assembled into the shape of a person. The Family Guy wiki describes Mort's defining characteristics directly, and without apparent awareness of how damaging the list is. His traits, as documented in the show's own fan materials, include being whiny and neurotic, being a hypochondriac, having terrible social skills, being physically unattractive, being gawky and awkward, and having a general inability to assert himself. These are not random personality quirks assigned to a character who happens to be Jewish. These are the specific traits that anti-Semitic caricature has attached to Jewish men for over a century. The nervous, physically weak, socially incompetent, money-anxious Jewish figure who exists in contrast to the confident, physically capable, socially fluent, non-Jewish characters around him. The show does not invent these traits for Mort. It inherits them. And the fact that they are inherited rather than invented does not make them less harmful. It makes them more so, because inherited stereotypes carry the weight of everything that came before them, all the contexts in which those same images were used to justify prejudice and worse. Mort's connection to money and finances runs through his appearances consistently. The very first time Jewish financial stereotypes appear in Family Guy in a significant way, in When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Mort is one of the characters involved. He shows up in Peter's shed looking for money, which is a small moment, but a telling one. The episode's entire premise, that Jewish people are naturally gifted with finances, is the same premise that defines how Mort relates to the world around him. His pharmacy is his livelihood, and his anxious relationship with it is a running source of comedy. The show returns to Mort's financial worries, his thriftiness, his concern about money, with a regularity that is not coincidental. The most direct and most documented example of the show using Mort as a vehicle for anti-Semitic imagery comes from season 12, in an episode called 3 Acts of God that aired in 2014. In this episode, Peter and his friends travel to Jerusalem as part of a plot to find God and convince him to stop interfering with the New England Patriots football team. While in Jerusalem, the characters encounter a crowd of people who all look like Mort Goldman. Multiple copies of him, a crowd of them, all displaying the same physical characteristics the show has established for the character across years of appearances. The characters attract this crowd by throwing pennies. The crowd of Mort Goldman clones scrambles for the pennies on the ground. The image is unambiguous. A crowd crowd of Jewish people, depicted through the show's established Jewish caricature, are shown scrambling for pennies thrown by the main characters as though they are pigeons being fed breadcrumbs in a park. The connection being made that Jewish people are so obsessed with money that they will literally scramble on the ground for loose change is one of the oldest and most persistent anti-Semitic ideas in Western history. It has appeared in anti-Semitic propaganda across centuries and across cultures. It was used in Nazi Germany. It has been used to justify discrimination, violence, and worse. It is not an edgy joke that might be misread. It is, in isolation from any satirical framing, a direct deployment of a deeply harmful image. The Anti-Defamation League, which is an organization that has monitored and responded to anti-Semitism in American public life since 1913, issued a formal public response to this episode. A spokesperson described the scenes as outrageous. The spokesperson also said something important that is worth quoting carefully. He said, "There are times when McFarland's tendency to use classic anti-Semitic ideas, such as the charge that Jewish people are money-hungry and greedy, or the belief that Jewish people control Hollywood, clearly crosses a line." He added that the organization did not believe McFarland himself was anti-Semitic, and that the show mocked many groups. But the spokesperson was specific about the penny scene. It crossed a line. That was the organization's formal assessment. A writer named Mark Pinsky, writing for the Jewish Daily Forward, went further than the Anti-Defamation League's measured response. He published a piece asking directly whether Family Guy was anti-Semitic, and answered the question with more force than the organization had used. He argued that McFarland's use of Jewish stereotypes across the show's run showed a consistent pattern rather than isolated incidents, that the show returned to the same images, the same traits, the same assumptions about Jewish people with a regularity that went beyond equal opportunity offense. He identified specific recurring elements: Jewish people as greedy, as cheap, as cowardly, as physically weak, as controlling Hollywood, as socially undesirable. He argued that other animated shows of the same era, The Simpsons, South Park, also featured Jewish characters, but handled them with more genuine warmth and less reliance on the most damaging stereotypes. He compared McFarland to Mel Gibson, which was a pointed choice given that Gibson had been publicly exposed for anti-Semitic statements in 2006. Pinsky was not arguing that McFarland hated Jewish people. He was arguing that McFarland kept reaching for the same harmful images without taking responsibility for what those images carried. McFarland's pattern of behavior outside the show contributed to this reading. At the 2013 Academy Awards, which he hosted, he performed a bit in which the character Ted told the actor Mark Wahlberg that if he wanted to work in Hollywood, he had to be Jewish. This joke relies on the anti-Semitic belief that Jewish people control the entertainment industry, a belief that has been used to justify discrimination against Jewish people in Hollywood and elsewhere for decades. McFarland framed it as a joke, but the joke only works if the audience accepts the premise, and the premise is a stereotype with a long and harmful history. In 2012, McFarland posted a message directed at Emmy voters that included the caption, "Come on, you bloated, overprivileged Brentwood Jews, let us into your little club." He attributed this to the character of Peter Griffin, which is a standard move, using a fictional character as the voice for something he does not want to fully own. The message was real. He wrote it, he sent it, and it reproduces, in crude form, the same idea that Jewish people in Hollywood operate as an exclusive club that controls access to success and recognition. Road to Germany, which was discussed in the research phase of this essay, is the episode most often cited as a counter-argument to the claim that Family Guy handles Jewish material carelessly. The episode, in which Mort accidentally travels back in time to Nazi-occupied Poland and spends the episode trying to survive, is frequently praised as one of the better entries in the show's Road to series. It received an Emmy nomination. It draws 9.07 million viewers in its original broadcast, and it handles the Holocaust with a seriousness that is not common in Family Guy. The opening scene, in which Brian and Stewie arrive at a Jewish wedding in Warsaw on September 1st, 1939, only to watch the celebration interrupted by the arrival of Nazi tanks, is described by some viewers as genuinely moving, as one of the few moments where Family Guy drops its protective layer of irony and lets something real through. But Road to Germany is also an episode in which Mort's Jewishness is the engine of every joke that is not about something else. He is in danger because he is Jewish. He is scared because he is Jewish. His physical cowardice, another trait the show has consistently assigned to him, is on full display throughout the episode. The scene where he is nearly caught disguised as a Catholic priest and responds to the danger by going into increasingly panicked detail about what the Nazis will do to his body plays his terror as comedy. The line where Stewie tells him that Helen Keller would notice he is Jewish is a joke that uses Mort's appearance, his physical presentation as a Jewish man, as the punchline. The episode carries cares about the Holocaust as a historical event. It is less careful about whether using Mort's body and fear as comedy is appropriate in that context. What runs through all of Mort's appearances, from his earliest scenes to the penny-throwing crowd in Jerusalem, is the absence of the thing that would make him a real character rather than a stereotype. Real characters have something that exists outside of what they represent. SpongeBob wants to fry patties and be loved, which is a desire that is his own, regardless of what he symbolizes. Cleveland wants, at various points, peace and respect and a family that works, desires that are his own, even when the show fails to honor them. Mort Goldman wants to not be sick, wants to not lose money, wants to not be in situations that frighten him. These are anxieties, not desires. They are defined by avoidance rather than aspiration, and they are, without exception, the anxieties that anti-Semitic tradition has assigned to Jewish men for as long as that tradition has existed. The show ran Mort as a recurring character for over 20 seasons. The Anti-Defamation League called a specific scene outrageous. A forward writer compared the creator to Mel Gibson. An Australian Jewish studies scholar named Devere Abramovich accused the show of reinforcing deeply embedded prejudices that still exist in the world. And the show kept going. Mort kept showing up. The pharmacy stayed open, the nervousness stayed, the money anxiety stayed, the physical cowardice stayed. Seth MacFarlane's defense, applied to Mort as to everything else, was that the show mocks everyone equally. That Jewish writers were in the room, that Mort gets sympathy sometimes, gets moments of humanity sometimes, gets treated as more than just his worst qualities sometimes. All of this is technically true, and none of it addresses the core argument, which is about what accumulates across years of repeated exposure to the same images of the same group, filtered through the same narrow set of assumptions. What accumulates is familiarity, and familiarity with a stereotype is not the same as understanding the people the stereotype claims to represent. It is, in fact, the opposite. The more familiar an audience becomes with a caricature, the easier it becomes to mistake the caricature for the real thing. Mort Goldman is a caricature. He was built from the same materials that anti-Semitic tradition has always used, assembled by writers who understood exactly what they were building, defended by a creator who knows enough about the history of those images to know better. And he has been running on primetime television in front of millions of people since 1999. __quote _11__. The images inside Mort Goldman and the reasoning behind them are connected directly to something McFarland said in 2012 that was more honest about the show's actual relationship to its own offensiveness than anything he had said before or since. It was not an apology. It was not a defense. It was a man trying to explain, in plain language, what was actually happening in the writer's room when these choices got made. And what he said revealed something important, not just about Family Guy, but about how a show can operate inside racism for decades, while its creator maintains, genuinely and without apparent shame, that nobody really gives a damn. Section 8, __quote _12 Comedy in the Holocaust, Season 7, Episode 3, 2008. There is a version of this episode that works. It is not a comfortable version. It is not a version that lets the audience off the hook, or makes the subject matter feel safe. But it exists, and the people who praise Road to Germany are not wrong to praise it, because the episode does something that Family Guy almost never does. It lets the real world in. It lets the weight of actual history press against the comedy, and in a few moments, the comedy stops, and the weight is just there, unmediated, real. The opening is the most significant of those moments. Brian and Stewie arrive in Warsaw, Poland on September 1st, 1939. They have traveled back in time to find Mort Goldman, who accidentally activated Stewie's time machine while looking for a bathroom. When they land, they find themselves at a Jewish wedding. The scene is drawn with more care than most Family Guy scenes get. The people at the wedding are dressed in the clothing of the era. The music playing is a real piece associated with Jewish celebration. The mood is warm and full and alive. And then, in the background, the sound changes. The music stops. People look up. Nazi tanks are rolling into the city. Germany has invaded Poland. The wedding is over. The episode has arrived at September 1st, 1939, the first day of World War II, and it has placed its characters inside a celebration that is about to become the beginning of the worst organized mass murder in modern human history. Some viewers have described the scene as the most genuinely affecting moment in Family Guy's entire run. One IMDb review called it one of the few moments where the show drops its irony and lets something real through. The show does not play this for laughs. It does not cut away. It lets the moment land land. And what lands is not comedy. What lands is the specific feeling of watching people who do not yet know what is coming in the last normal moment before everything changes, while you sit in the audience knowing exactly what is coming because it is recorded history. That moment is real. It earns the praise it gets, and it makes Road to Germany a more complicated episode to talk about than most of the content in this essay, because it is not a simple case of a bad choice made by careless writers. It is a case of a genuinely moving piece of storytelling, sharing space with material that uses Mort Goldman's body, his fear, and his Jewish identity as a source of comedy in a context where those things are anything but funny. Road to Germany aired on October 19th, 2008. It was written by Patrick Megan and directed by Greg Colton. It was watched by 9.07 million viewers in its original broadcast, making it the most watched show on Fox's animation domination block that night, beating The Simpsons, American Dad, and The Cleveland Show. It received an Emmy nomination in 2009 for Outstanding Comedy Series, alongside 2 other Family Guy episodes from the same season. By ratings and industry recognition, it was a success. The plot: once Brian and Stewie find Mort and realize the time machine's return pad needs uranium to work, becomes an adventure story. The 3 of them need to get to England, where Mort will be safe because England is not yet occupied by Nazi Germany. They cross borders, disguise themselves, chase and get chased, ultimately join the Royal Air Force and fly a bombing mission to Berlin to get the uranium they need from a nuclear research facility. The episode is full of movie references. There are clear nods to Back to the Future, U-571, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Flash Gordon with music from the Queen soundtrack, and Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers film, in a scene where Stewie meets Hitler and they recreate the mirror sequence from that movie. The episode is ambitious in its construction. It moves fast. It is well made by the technical standards of what Family Guy does. Mort Goldman is the engine of almost all of it, and Mort Goldman's engine is his Jewishness. Every time the episode needs to generate danger, it uses Mort's Jewish identity as the fuel. Every time it needs a joke from the situation, Mort's fear of being discovered, his physical anxiety, his visible panic in the presence of Nazi soldiers is the source. The logic is straightforward, and the show does not pretend otherwise. Mort is at risk because he is Jewish. The Nazis want to kill him because he is Jewish. Everything that happens in the episode is shaped by the fact that he is Jewish. This is not a choice the episode made carelessly. It is the entire premise. The writers chose to put a Jewish character into the Holocaust because the comedy that results from that situation is available, and the show wanted to use it. The scene that most clearly illustrates the tension at the center of this episode involves Mort disguising himself as a Catholic priest to cross a German checkpoint. He is nearly caught. A German officer asks him to perform last rites for a dying soldier, which Mort cannot do because he does not know Catholic prayers. Before the real priest arrives and blows his cover, Mort responds to the danger by going into detailed, panicked description of what the Nazis will do to his body if they catch him. The description is played for laughs. The specifics of what Mort imagines the Nazis doing to him are presented as comedy because of how Mort describes them in his characteristic, whiny, neurotic, overly detailed way. The audience laughs at Mort's fear. This is the core problem with Road to Germany's approach to its subject matter. The Holocaust is not a backdrop. It is the context that gives everything in the episode its stakes. And using a Jewish character's terror of being murdered in the Holocaust as a laugh source, not as a way of humanizing that terror, not as a way of making the audience feel what it would actually mean to be Jewish in occupied Europe, but as a source of comedy derived from the character's physical mannerisms and verbal delivery, is a choice that the episode's genuinely affecting opening scene does not fully earn the right to make. The line Stewie delivers when Mort tries to insist that his position is not obvious, that Stewie observes Helen Keller would notice he is Jewish, is a joke about Mort's physical appearance. It says that something about how Mort looks, how he is drawn, makes him visibly and unmistakably Jewish, in a way that is almost comically obvious. This is the show using its own character design as the punchline. The way Mort looks, the thick glasses, the hunched posture, the exaggerated nose, the pale and slight build, is so immediately legible as the show's shorthand for Jewish that even a person who was blind and deaf could supposedly identify it. The joke treats Mort's physical presentation as inherently funny, and that physical presentation was built from the same tradition of caricature that anti-Semitic imagery has always drawn on. Jewish executive producer David A. Goodman read the script aloud to the writer's room before production. This is documented. The episode went through a review process that included at least one Jewish person in a position of authority. It received an Emmy nomination. It was praised by critics and fans. None of this means the concerns about it are invalid. It means that a piece of work can be praised and concerning at the same time. That recognition from the industry and genuine craft and execution do not automatically answer questions about what the work is doing with its subject matter. The Emmy nomination the episode received was for Outstanding Comedy Series. It was nominated alongside I Dream of Jesus and Family Gay, two other Season 7 episodes. It did not win. The nomination tells you that the television industry in 2009 considered the episode one of the better pieces of comedy produced that year. The nomination does not tell you whether the episode's use of Jewish fear and Jewish identity as comedy in a Holocaust setting was an appropriate choice. The television industry has historically not been the most reliable judge of that kind of question. What Road to Germany ultimately reveals about Family Guy is something that was already visible in When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, but is clearer here because the stakes are so much higher. The show is genuinely capable of handling difficult historical material with care. The opening Warsaw wedding sequence proves this. The show knows how to let real weight in, but it also consistently treats that capability as permission to use the same subject matter in ways that are less careful, as though having done something respectful once buys the right to do something less respectful immediately afterward. The careful opening and the Mort as comedy engine second and third acts are not two separate choices that happen to be in the same episode. They are the same episode, making two different choices about what Jewish suffering is for. For the opening, Jewish suffering is a historical reality that deserves to be acknowledged with gravity. For the rest of the episode, it is the mechanism that generates the chase scenes, the disguise jokes, the priest checkpoint, the descriptions of Nazi torture, the Helen Keller line. The episode uses the gravity of the opening to establish that it takes the Holocaust seriously, and then uses Mort Goldman's terrified Jewish body as the comedy engine for everything that follows. Fans of the episode often point to the fact that Mort is not mocked, that the episode is sympathetic to him, that his fear is understandable given his situation, that the show is not laughing at Jewish people for being in danger. This is a fair point as far as it goes. The episode is not cruel to Mort in the way that some Family Guy content is cruel to its targets. It is not making fun of him for being Jewish. It is using his Jewishness as the engine of an adventure story that also happens to be set inside one of the most devastating events in human history. But there is a question underneath that defense that the defense does not fully answer. When you take the most extreme historical example of what Jewish people have suffered because of who they are, and you use a Jewish character's terror of that suffering as a source of comedy, what are you actually saying about the relationship between Jewish experience and entertainment? What are you modeling for the audience about what Jewish fear is available for? Road to Germany is the most praised episode in this essay's subject matter. It is also, arguably, the one that most clearly reveals the gap between what Family Guy is capable of and what Family Guy consistently chooses to do. Because the capability is there. The Warsaw Wedding proves it. The show knows how to treat this material with the gravity it deserves. It simply does not always choose to. The Emmy nomination was real. The 9.07 million viewers were real. The praise from fans who described the opening as one of the most affecting moments in the show's history is real. And the question of whether a Jewish character's terror of being murdered in the Holocaust is appropriate comedy material is also real. And it does not go away because the episode is well made, or because Jewish writers were in the room, or because it got nominated for an award. All of that can be true at once. The episode can be good, and the question can still stand. What makes Road to Germany important to this conversation is not that it is the worst thing Family Guy did with Jewish material. It is not. The penny scene in 3 Acts of God, where a crowd of Mort Goldman clones scrambles for throne change on the streets of Jerusalem, is a more direct and less defensible deployment of anti-Semitic imagery. Road to Germany is important because it is the show at its most ambitious with this material. The show trying hardest to do something real with it, and still producing something that raises questions the show does not ask itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The questions the show does not ask itself about what is available for comedy, about whose suffering can be used as entertainment material, about what accumulates across decades of returning to the same images of the same groups, are exactly the questions that Seth McFarland answered in 2012 in a way that was more honest than anything he had said before. And what he said was not a defense of the show's choices. It was something closer to an admission that the choices were not always driven by the reasons the show claimed they were. It was a creator telling a reporter in plain language that that maybe the psychology was simpler and less noble than equal opportunity satire, that maybe there was a part of him that never left high school, that maybe the reason they kept doing it was that they were laughing because they were not supposed to, and at the core, none of them really gave a damn. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane's own confession. Maybe there's a part of me stuck in high school. In 2012, a reporter from The New Yorker sat down with Seth MacFarlane and asked him about the show's racial humor. Not about a specific episode, not about a specific joke that had recently caused trouble, about the general pattern, the consistent return to racial and ethnic stereotypes across 13 years of television. The equal opportunity offense-defense the show had been using since its first season, what it all actually meant about the people making the decisions in the writer's room. MacFarlane answered. He did not deflect. He did not reach immediately for the standard defenses about satire and intention and Jewish writers on staff. He gave an answer that started with the defense, and then, partway through, shifted into something else entirely. Something that the interviewer could not have expected, and that MacFarlane probably should not have said out loud if he wanted the standard defense to keep working. He said, "We are presenting the Archie Bunker point of view, and making fun of the stereotypes, not making fun of the groups. But if I'm really being honest, then maybe there is a part of me that is stuck in high school, and we are laughing because we are not supposed to. I do not know the psychology. At the core, I know none of us gives a damn." Read that again slowly. The first sentence is the defense the show has always used. The reference to Archie Bunker is a reference to the character from the 1970s television show All in the Family, a bigoted, working-class man whose prejudiced worldview was presented as something the audience was meant to recognize as wrong, as the thing being mocked, rather than the thing being celebrated. The Archie Bunker defense says that Peter Griffin is the joke, not the groups Peter makes offensive comments about. Peter is the fool. His bigotry is what the show is laughing at. The audience is supposed to be in on this, supposed to understand that when Peter says something racist, the comedy comes from recognizing how wrong he is, rather than from agreeing with him. This is a legitimate way to do comedy. All in the Family was a legitimately important piece of television that used Archie Bunker's prejudice to hold a mirror up to attitudes that were common and harmful and rarely examined directly in mainstream entertainment. The Archie Bunker model works when the show is careful enough, precise enough, and consistent enough in its framing that the audience always understands which direction the joke is pointed. MacFarlane starts with this defense and then abandons it in the same breath. Maybe there is a part of me stuck in high school. We are laughing because we are not supposed to. None of us gives a damn. This is not a defense of satire. This is a description of something much simpler and much harder to justify. We are laughing because we are not supposed to is not the same as we are using comedy to critique prejudice. It is a description of transgression for its own sake, of finding something funny specifically because it crosses a line, not because crossing the line reveals anything true or meaningful. It is, in plain language, the admission that part of the reason Family Guy kept making racial and ethnic jokes for 13 years at that point was the thrill of saying the thing you are not supposed to say. Not the insight, not the critique, not the satire, the thrill. And then, none of us gives a damn. At the core, none of us gives a damn. This line was reported by Newsweek in 2020 when they covered the Mike Henry casting situation, citing it as evidence that Family Guy's race problems ran deeper than simply who was doing the voice of Cleveland Brown. The full quote had been available since the 2012 New Yorker profile, but it gained renewed attention in the context of a public reckoning over race in entertainment. Because none of us gives a damn is not a sophisticated position. It is not a creative philosophy. It is a shrug. That shrug is the most important thing MacFarlane ever said publicly about Family Guy's approach to race. More important than any of the defenses. More important than the rabbis who approved When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. More important than the Jewish writers on staff. More important than the brief corrective speeches and the learning moments and the PSA parody at the end of The Sun Also Draws. All of those things were the show performing awareness of what it was doing. The 2012 New Yorker quote is the creator describing what was actually happening, which was that the awareness was largely decorative, and the engine underneath it was something much simpler. The Archie Bunker comparison that MacFarlane uses is worth examining more carefully, because researchers have actually studied how audiences receive that kind of comedy, and the results are not comfortable for the defense. A study published in the Journal of Humor Studies, referenced in the academic analysis of Family Guy's racial content, examined what happens when audiences do not recognize that a bigoted character is supposed to be the butt of the joke. The finding was that a significant portion of audiences who encounter Archie Bunker-style comedy come away not having processed the critique. They came away having simply enjoyed the bigotry. They laughed at the same jokes, but for the opposite reason the show intended. This is the encoding and decoding problem that academic work on media has documented for decades. A show produces content with a specific intended meaning. The audience receives it and interprets it, but the interpretation is not controlled by the producers. Different viewers bring different assumptions, different experiences, different frameworks for understanding what they are watching. A viewer who is already comfortable with anti-Semitic stereotypes does not watch Mort Goldman scrambling for pennies and think that Family Guy is mocking the stereotype. They watch Mort Goldman scrambling for pennies and find the stereotype confirmed. The show provides the image, the audience brings the meaning, and the show cannot control which meaning arrives. McFarland knew this. He has been in the entertainment industry long enough, has been through enough controversy, has read enough critical responses to his work to understand that the audience for Family Guy is not a single unified group of people who all process the show's offensive content the same way. He knew in 2012 that some portion of his audience was not catching the satire, was not recognizing Peter as the fool, was receiving the racial jokes as simply racial jokes, rather than as critiques of the worldview that produces them. He knew this, and the quote tells you how he felt about it. None of us gives a damn. The second part of McFarland's public record on this subject involves the 2013 Academy Awards, which he hosted. This was one of the most watched broadcasts in Oscar history. McFarland performed a bit during the ceremony in which the character Ted from his 2012 film of the same name told the actor Mark Wahlberg that if he wanted to work in Hollywood, he needed to be Jewish. The joke received criticism from the Anti-Defamation League and from Jewish advocacy groups, who noted that it reproduced the anti-Semitic belief that Jewish people control the Hollywood entertainment industry. McFarland defended the joke by pointing to the context and the tone, suggesting the audience understood it was not meant seriously. This defense followed the same structure as every other defense McFarland has offered for content that drew complaints. The intent was satirical. The audience understood. The joke was at the expense of the stereotype, not the people the stereotype targets. 3 years earlier, in 2012, before his own cameras and his own editing team, he had told a reporter that maybe the real reason they kept making these jokes was that they were not supposed to, and that none of them really gave a damn. The defense and the confession exist in the same person's public record, a year apart, aimed at different audiences. One is for the press release. One slipped out in a long-form profile when the reporter asked the right question at the right moment. The social media post from 2012 adds another layer to this. McFarland, promoting Family Guy's Emmy campaign that year, posted a message directed at Emmy voters that described them as bloated, overprivileged Brentwood Jews. He framed this as a Peter Griffin joke, as a piece of character comedy, rather than as his own voice. But the post was real. He wrote it, he sent it from his account, and it reproduced, in a few words, the idea that Jewish people in the entertainment industry operate as an exclusive club defined by their Jewishness, which is one of the oldest anti-Semitic narratives about Hollywood. The pattern across all of this is consistent. McFarland uses characters, Peter Griffin, Ted, Stewie, as vehicles for things he does not want to fully own as his own voice. The character is the speaker. McFarland is just writing the character. This structure provides the same protection the show itself provides to the content within it. The racist joke is Peter's racist joke. The anti-Semitic comment is Ted's anti-Semitic comment. The bigotry belongs to the fictional figure rather than to the person who invented the fictional figure, put words in his mouth, and built an entertainment empire on the resulting content. This is the structure that the equal opportunity offense defense is built on. Everybody gets mocked. The mockery belongs to Peter, not to the show. The show is simply showing you Peter. And if you come away having absorbed the stereotype rather than the critique, that is your misreading of the show's intent, not the show's responsibility. What McFarland's 2012 confession does is remove this defense from underneath itself. He says the quiet part out loud. He says that maybe the psychology is simpler than satire. Maybe it is just laughing because you are not supposed to. Maybe the intent the show claims is not the actual operating engine. Maybe none of them give a damn. This matters enormously for the larger argument this essay has been building, because every episode discussed in these pages, the casino episode, Turban Cowboy, Baby Got Black, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Road to Germany, every Cleveland scene, every Mort Goldman appearance, has been defended at at one point or another by pointing to intent. The show meant to mock the stereotype, not the group. The show was aware of the history. The show was using the content to make a larger point. The intent was satirical. Seth MacFarlane, in 2012, told The New Yorker that maybe that was not entirely true, that maybe there was a part of him that never grew past high school, that at the core, none of them gave a damn. He said this about a show that had been running for 13 years at that point, a show that had reached tens of millions of viewers every week, a show that had made him one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in American television, a show that was, as he spoke those words, still going, still making the same kinds of jokes, still using the same defenses, still putting the same images on screen every Sunday night without apparent consequence. None of them gave a damn. He said it, he meant it, and then he went back to work. Quote 15 The question that follows from this confession is the one that has been sitting underneath this entire essay. If the people making Family Guy did not particularly care about the impact of what they were making, who did? Who was keeping count? Who was responsible for the accumulated weight of 20 plus years of racial and ethnic content processed by hundreds of millions of viewers who were not, in many cases, carefully unpacking the satirical framing on a Sunday night while half watching the television? The answer, as the last section of this essay makes clear, involves a specific and revealing history of defenses, disclaimers, and institutions that looked at the content, wrote their letters, issued their statements, and watched the show keep going anyway. Because the mechanics of how Family Guy survived every controversy it generated were as carefully constructed as anything else in its long, strange history. Section 10, the quote 16 defense, and what academic research says about it. Every time Family Guy got into trouble, the defense arrived before the apology did. Usually, the apology never came at all. What came instead was a specific set of arguments deployed in a specific order by specific people. McFarland in interviews, Fox in press statements, writers on social media, and the show itself through characters who would occasionally step forward to acknowledge that what you just watched was offensive before the episode continued doing the offensive thing anyway. The arguments were not random. They were a system. And the system was effective enough that Family Guy ran for over 25 years through cancellations and revivals and boycott campaigns and anti-defamation league statements and Parents Television Council complaints and Boston Marathon timing disasters and casting controversies and federal lawsuits without ever being made to fundamentally change what it was doing with racial and ethnic content. Understanding how that system worked is the last piece of this conversation. The central argument is the equal opportunity offender defense. The claim is simple. Family Guy mocks everyone. No group is safe. Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, black people, white people, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian people, disabled people, gay people, straight people. If you can be mocked, the show has probably mocked you. Because the mockery is distributed across all groups, no single group is being singled out for special treatment. Nobody is the real target. Everybody is the target, which means, in effect, that nobody is. This argument has genuine appeal. It sounds fair. It sounds like what a truly neutral, truly free comedy should be able to claim. It positions the show as operating above group loyalty, above the politics of who is allowed to make fun of whom, above the kinds of sensitivity that might limit what comedy can do. It frames the offensive content as the price of a broader freedom that ultimately benefits everyone. Because if everyone is equally available to be mocked, then the comedy cannot be weaponized against any particular group. Seth MacFarlane stated this defense explicitly and repeatedly. He made the Archie Bunker comparison. He cited the Jewish writers on staff. He noted that Peter Griffin is the show's biggest fool, that the most clueless character in Quahog is a white working-class man, that the show was always pointing at Peter's worldview as the problem rather than endorsing it. These arguments were real, and they were not without merit. They were the honest articulation of what the show believed itself to be doing. Academic research, however, does not fully support the conclusion the defense is meant to produce. The most direct challenge comes from the thesis published through SUNY Cortland, which examined Family Guy's racial content in sustained detail. The paper's central argument is built around a specific point about what equal opportunity offense actually means when applied to groups that do not occupy equal positions in American society. The argument goes like this. When a show mocks stereotypes associated with all groups equally, it treats all groups as though the stereotypes attached to them carry equal weight and equal history. But they do not. The stereotype of a white suburban dad who is bad at directions carries a different kind of weight than the stereotype of a Jewish person obsessed with money, which carries a different kind of weight than the stereotype of a black person as passive and accepting of mistreatment, which carries a different kind of weight than the stereotype of a Muslim person as a potential terrorist. The difference is not just about which stereotypes are more flattering, it is about what each stereotype has been used to do in the real world. The Jewish money obsession stereotype has been used to justify discrimination, exclusion, and violence against Jewish people for centuries. The Muslim as terrorist stereotype has been used to justify surveillance, detention, and hate crimes against Muslim and Arab Americans since 2001. The stereotype of black passivity has been used to argue that black people do not need advocacy or protection because they accept their circumstances without complaint. These stereotypes are not merely embarrassing, they have consequences. They shape how people are treated by institutions, by strangers, by the legal system, by the government. When Family Guy deploys all of these stereotypes with equal energy and defends itself by saying it mocks everyone equally, the defense assumes that the stereotypes are equivalent in their impact. The research says they are not. A professor named Robin Coleman, whose work is cited in the academic analysis, argued that stereotypes about blackness carry a longer and more damaging historical legacy than the stereotypes of other groups in the American context, making their casual repetition particularly harmful, even when the intent is satirical. This is not an argument that other groups cannot be harmed by stereotypes. It is an argument that the equal opportunity offense defense fails to account for the unequal history that different stereotypes bring with them. The second major challenge to the defense comes from research into how audiences actually receive the kind of comedy Family Guy produces. The Journal of Humor Studies published work examining what happens when viewers encounter what researchers call disparagement humor, comedy that targets specific groups through mockery and stereotype. The consistent finding across multiple studies is that this kind of humor does not produce the same effect in all viewers. For viewers who are already prejudiced against the group being mocked, disparagement humor tends to reinforce existing attitudes rather than critique them. It functions as permission, as social proof that the attitudes they already hold are acceptable enough to be the subject of mainstream entertainment. The joke does not land as satire for these viewers. It lands as confirmation. This finding directly undermines the Archie Bunker defense. The Archie Bunker model assumes that the audience recognizes the bigot as the fool, that the framing of the joke makes clear who is being laughed at. But research shows that a portion of the audience does not make this distinction. A viewer who is already comfortable with the idea that Jewish people are money obsessed does not watch Mort Goldman throwing pennies and think that Family Guy is mocking that stereotype. They watch Mort Goldman and find their existing belief reflected back at them. Apparently acceptable enough for primetime television. McFarland knew this was happening. His 2012 New Yorker quote, "None of us gives a damn," suggests he had made peace with it. The research suggests he should not have. The third challenge to the defense is practical and documented. Family Guy's racial content was not actually distributed equally across all groups. The groups that received the most sustained, most repeated, most structurally embedded treatment were the same groups that appear in this essay. Jewish characters through Mort Goldman across 20-plus seasons. Black characters through Cleveland Brown across 21 years and a spin-off. Muslim characters through the specific terrorist framing of Turban Cowboy and multiple cutaway gags. Native American characters across multiple episodes that returned to the same teepee and headdress imagery. The show mocked white people too, but white people in Family Guy are mocked for being silly, for being oblivious, for being incompetent. They are not mocked through images that have been used to justify their persecution. The cultural critic Rob Schmidt, who documented Native American representation in media, made this point specifically about Family Guy's treatment of indigenous people. He argued that no other group in the show received the same level of sustained, historically frozen representation, the same willingness to depict a living population entirely through imagery that is 150 years old. His argument was not that other groups were treated well. It was that the depth and consistency of the treatment of Native Americans in Family Guy was qualitatively different from how the show handled most other groups, in ways the equal opportunity defense could not account for. The Parents Television Council, which spent years filing complaints with the Federal Communications Commission about Family Guy's content, made a different version of the same point. The organization placed Family Guy on its worst television shows for family viewing list in 2000, 2005, and 2006. It logged the show as its worst show of the week more than 40 times across its run. The FCC received the complaints and mostly denied them, finding on several occasions that the content did not meet the legal definition of indecent broadcasting. But the volume of complaints and the specific nature of what was being complained about documented in real time how the show's content was being received by a significant portion of its audience. People were not reading it as satire. They were reading it as the thing itself. The show's own behavior when challenged also reveals something about how seriously it took the equal opportunity defense. When the Boston Marathon bombing happened a month after Turban Cowboy aired, Fox pulled the episode from streaming immediately. They did not defend it as satire. They did not issue a statement about equal opportunity offense. They pulled it quietly and said nothing. When the Mike Henry casting situation became public in 2020, the show changed the voice actor without making a broader commitment to restructuring how Cleveland was written or how the show's writing staff was composed. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein became a controversy, Fox sat on it for 4 years rather than defending it as legitimate comedy. The equal opportunity defense was always available in press statements and interviews. When actual consequences arrived, the show and the network tended to act like the defense was not quite strong enough to stand behind in public. The question of who benefited from the defense is also worth examining. The equal opportunity offense framework protected the show from accountability by making any specific complaint seem like special pleading. If you objected to the Turban Cowboy episode's portrayal of Muslims, the response was that the show also mocked Christians, that Peter had converted to multiple religions and found them all wanting, that no group was being singled out. This response put the burden on the complaining party to prove that their group's treatment was somehow different from the treatment of other groups, which is a difficult argument to make in the context of a show that generated controversy with enough regularity that any individual complaint could always be placed next to 5 other complaints from different groups. The people who were most protected by this framework were the people making the show. The equal opportunity defense kept the show from having to make changes because it kept any individual criticism from gaining enough traction to demand a response. If everybody was equally offended, nobody had the standing to demand that the show behave differently. The defense was not just a philosophical position, it was a practical shield, and it worked for over 2 decades. What academic research ultimately says about Family Guy's approach to racial and ethnic content is not that the show is uniquely or historically evil, not that McFarland is a personally hateful person, not that anyone who ever laughed at the show is morally compromised. The research says something more precise and more useful than any of those claims. It says that the equal opportunity offense defense fails on its own terms, that it assumes equal impact where there is unequal history, that it assumes audience understanding where research shows misunderstanding, that it assumes the mockery is always pointed at the stereotype rather than through the stereotype at the group. An Entertainment Weekly critic called the show racist, anti-Semitic, and vile swill in its 2nd season in 1999. The show ran for 25 more years after that review was published. The Parents Television Council called it the worst show of the week more than 40 times. The Anti-Defamation League called specific scenes outrageous. A federal lawsuit was filed over a song about needing a Jewish person to help with finances. An episode was pulled from streaming for nearly a decade after a real bombing. A white actor voiced the show's primary black character for 21 years. Academic researchers published detailed arguments that the show's racial content reproduced structures of minstrelsy and reinforced harmful stereotypes under the cover of satire. And the show kept going. It generated more episodes, more controversies, more defenses, more complaints, more academic papers, more press statements, more Sunday nights of millions of viewers watching Peter Griffin say things that made some of them laugh and some of them angry, and some of them both at once. Seth MacFarlane told The New Yorker in 2012 that none of them gave a damn. The show's history suggests he was telling the truth. And the equal opportunity offense-defense, examined carefully and honestly, turns out to be less of a philosophical position and more of a very effective way of giving a damn about nothing while making it look like you were thinking carefully about everything. Family Guy got away with it. For over 25 years, across hundreds of episodes, through every controversy and every complaint and every pulled episode and every casting change and every academic paper and every Anti-Defamation League statement, the show got away with it. The question is not whether it did. The evidence in this essay makes that clear. The question is what getting away with something for that long in front of that many people actually costs. And that is a question the show was never asked to answer, which may be the most revealing thing about it of all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.